Welcome to our first story for Black History Month. This is video number 1 in a series of brief lessons on historical black figures whose incredible stories you may or may not know about. During Black History Month, you may often hear a lot about the achievements of people like Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, and Rosa Parks. But I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about someone you may not have heard of, Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was born into slavery on April 5, 1839, in Beaufort, South Carolina. Enslaved people were considered as property at the time, and Smalls, along with his mother, belonged to a man named Henry McKee. McKee often hired Robert out to work other jobs, and by doing so, he would receive the money instead of Smalls. One such job was at a local port in Charleston, South Carolina. It's at this job that Smalls became an expert navigator of the Charleston Harbor and surrounding rivers and coastline.
Despite being an excellent pilot of the boat, enslaved people were not allowed to be called captains at the time. But in 1856, at the age of 17, Robert fell in love and married a woman named Hannah Jones. Hannah already had 2 daughters when they were married, but the couple soon had a 3rd child of their own. Robert had seen horrible things happen to enslaved people and feared that he would be separated from his family. So he began to plan a way to escape slavery.
With the Civil War starting in April of 1861, the Confederate Army hired Robert to work on a military transport ship named the Planter. His job was to bring the ship along the coastline around Charleston, laying mines, transporting ammunition, and delivering Confederate troops and messages. But as the war continued, Robert continued to hear stories of thousands of slaves being freed by the Union Army, the very people he was hired to fight. He could see the Union blockade just outside of Charleston Harbor, and he knew if he could get his family to the Union, they would be free. There were many other enslaved people working aboard the Planter, so Robert hatched a plan where he would use the Planter to escape.
On May 13, 1862, he saw the perfect opportunity for escape.
The ship was recently loaded with several large cannons and a ton of ammunition, and the white officers went ashore to spend the night on land, leaving Robert and his fellow enslaved crewmen in charge of the ship. Earlier in the day, Robert's family, as well as members of the crew, had boarded a ship just to the north of where the Planter was docked. Everything was in place, just as Smalls had planned, and around 3 in the morning, Robert and the crew took the ship out. In order to pass the checkpoints, Robert dressed in the captain's uniform.
What?
No, not that kind of captain. Much better.
To cover his face, he wore a straw hat that the captain often wore. As they approached the first checkpoint, the rest of the crewmen hid from view. Robert gave the appropriate signals and began to move past the checkpoint.
If his plan had failed, he would have been killed. The Planter made it past the checkpoint and picked up his family members.
Then it headed out of the harbor towards the Union blockade. After successfully getting past the big guns at Fort Sumter, the ship began to approach the blockade. Robert changed out the Confederate flag for a white flag and prayed that the Union would see it before they fired on the ship. Fortunately, a Union ship called the Onward spotted the white flag and approached the Planter without firing. Robert Smalls, his family, and all of the enslaved people on board were now free and received prize money for the large haul of weapons that they took. Soon thereafter, Smalls traveled to Washington to meet with President Lincoln, where he helped to persuade the president to permit black men to serve for the Union Army. Soon after the meeting, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, ordered 5,000 former enslaved people to fight for the Union. Around this time, Smalls joined the Union Army to fight against the Confederacy and became the first African American captain of a U.S. military ship. In 1897, by an act of Congress, Smalls was granted a pension equal to that of a Navy captain and returned home to South Carolina, where he bought his former master's house. He then became active in politics. In 1874, Smalls was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served 5 terms. While serving there, he fought for the rights of African American citizens in South Carolina. Robert Smalls died of malaria and diabetes in 1915, but his bravery and courage in the face of slavery remain a legend to this day.